every semester I teach a class in public policy in the School for Public Affairs. And I have made it my business as a part of that class to introduce students to some, and I underscore the word, some traditions uh, of our principles of our bedrock constitutional form of government. And if I may, and if I sound like a teacher, it is because that is who I see myself as constantly. And so I want to do a little part of what I would do in that class, but really with an eye towards getting to some discussion of racial justice and racial equity. And there's so many different ways that one could approach that subject. But having said that, it is fair to say that I think that the attendees that are here would recognize that, for example, the first 10 amendments are widely viewed as our Bill of Rights. And it is there that it is in that context that I want to single out one of these particular amendments that is a part of our Bill of Rights, and to hone in on it and to talk and to then frame that in the context of racial justice. So I want to specifically focus on the Fourth Amendment. And for those of you, because I said I'm a teacher that are taking notes, you should know that the Fourth Amendment guarantees that all citizens shall be free from governmental searches and seizures. And I tell my class that is a description of a warrantless search, that the government that the citizens should be free to expect that they should be free from unreasonable searches and seizures. That is what is guaranteed under the Fourth Amendment. So the Fourth Amendment has to do with searches and seizures. And so another way of saying that is that the government should be prohibited or is prohibited from engaging in searching of a person's property and or seizing a person's property unless you have a qualified reason to do so. You have a warrant to do so. And then I say to students, but there are also exceptions to the Fourth Amendment on unreasonable searches and seizures. So for those of you who are taking notes, I provide students with a mnemonic device at this time. And I say to students that the exceptions to the Fourth Amendment search against unreasonable searches and seizures, except that you have a warrant, is what I tell students are your BACPIES exception, BACHPIES exceptions. And I'll run through them quickly, but I really want to get to the S exception, although there in recent times there have been an additional S exception having to do school safety, but I don't want to get to that. But I want to get to this S exception because it is there that I want to lend a little bit more discussion as it relates to the question of racial justice in the United States of America. So the B exception is a border exception. It is interesting to note that I told some students last night in my public policy class that if you were to watch or see the movie Ray, it's a story about the life of Ray Charles. I pay close attention to things that other people do not see in movies. But in that particular movie, Ray Charles does a performance in Montreal. He and his entourage gets on a plane and they'll land in Boston. I don't know if it was called Logan Airport at that time, but they'll land in Boston. And for all intents and purposes, when they landed in Boston after having left Montreal, they were now re-entering the border of the United States of America at Logan Airport. And so the participants on this call should know that any time that you enter the functional borders of the United States, Kennedy Airport, Logan, wherever, you are at the border, and your rights to be free from unreasonable searches and seizures gets thrown out the window, as was the case of Ray Charles. And the government has an interest now in asking you to open up your luggage, and that they can search any other thing because you're at the border. I'll leave that alone. If you guys want a much more detailed lecture on that, I'll be happy to do that. So the A exception is automobile exceptions. I say to my class often, in a lot of ways, the automobile exception can be tied to the whole discussion of driving while Black in America. And I think that it is interesting to note, again, for the participants, Channel 13 just did a wonderful series about focusing on the automobile and its impact and the lives of Blacks as we migrate from the South to the North. A really, really wonderful conversation. But in it is this whole question of what can the police, without a warrant, search in your car? And the general view is if you are legally stopped by the police, then the government, in the form of the police, has a right to search common areas inside of the car, not the trunk, not the hood. And the policy justification there was to provide safety and protection for the police officer. So there's an automobile exception. The C is consent searches. The former Attorney General of the United States, Mr. Holder, having gone to school in Washington, D.C., as I did, even he commented that there were many times that he was stopped on the I-95 corridor, and the police would use the excuse that it is a known conduit for weapons and for drugs. But even notwithstanding that, in order for the police to, without some other reasonable suspicion, to get into your trunk and or your car, get into your trunk or the hood, in order for them to do so outside of a warrant, would be to get consent from the driver. And so the question is, what reasonably prudent person, knowing that you have illegal contraband in your trunk, would give police consent to search the trunk? So it has always been viewed suspiciously as to how police could ever get into places that you have an expectation of privacy for in the absence of a warrant. But suffice it to say, the C is consent. The H is hot pursuit. If the police put their lights on and you refuse to stop and they have to chase you down, that is, and I'm going over these exceptions quite quickly, that is a hot pursuit. The P is plain view. If I were to be watching the Jets and the Giants, both of them are awful, and I had friends at the house, and we had a spread on the table of Tostitos and the dips and everything, and I choked on one of the Tostitos, and someone called 911. That is an invitation for 911 and the police to respond. And if right on the table was some illegal contraband, because it is in plain sight of the eyes of the police officers, that contraband could be seized. Again, I'd be happy to come back and to talk in greater detail about each and every one of these, but I want to move quickly. So the P is plain view. The I is the officer, police, or the government agent says you're under arrest. This is what we call incident to a lawful arrest. Once you're under lawful arrest, the police can then search your body as a part of the administrative processing. And then the last one is the one that I really want to focus on. There is a school exception, as I said, is the S exception, which is stop and frisk stop and inquire, stop and pat. And if you have lived in New York City during the Bloomberg administration, you will know and you would recognize that the whole question of stop and frisk became an issue of paramount concern to all of us. During his administration, there were in excess at any one time over or close to, and some people would say, some statistics would say over 100,000 stop and frisk and stop and inquire events by the police officers. So I want to share with the participants that this S exception, and I say this to my class, that it got so pervasive in New York is deeply troubling, because there was already an existing law in the United States of America that should have governed this matter altogether. And so if you're taking some notes as I speak, there is a landmark case out of Ohio called Terry versus Ohio. And it is still the law of the land today. It is called the Terry stop. The story of Terry was that the police officer on his beat saw a number of men walking back and forth a number of times in front of a store. He having observed that, and he being an officer on the beat for a number of years and seeing this behavior, ultimately stopped these, approached these young men, stopped them, inquired about why they were there. They couldn't give a good explanation, and for which he then subjected them to searches in which weapons were retrieved. This case came all the way to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court affirmed that if the state can show that you have a reasonable suspicion, given what this officer saw, that was enough. But that it never negated the state's responsibility not to use race as a basis for government action. And that is what manifestly that was manifestly clear that was what was happening during the Bloomberg administration, that race was being used as the basis for engaging in stops. And when this happens, this clearly violates the Constitution of the United States of America. Ultimately, it would take a judge to rule that this was in fact the case. I don't believe that we should have ever gone that far to have had federal intervention to vindicate the rights of people of color in the United States of America. But that is what it took. Sociologists, and again, I introduced this in my class, sought to provide, well, I take that back. Sociologists had an explanation, or they offered an explanation for the kind of aggressive policing that took place during the Bloomberg administration. Many of you will remember that it came out of a sociology class, would remember that the doctrine that was used was something called the broken windows theory. And essentially the broken windows theory makes the argument, and I'm paraphrasing it now. If you go into the subway and you allow, and the authorities, the government allow me to spit on the platform and there is no action. If you allow me to play my radio on the station and there is no police action, the smallest crime, the smallest incident of illegal behavior, no matter how small, if you don't interdict it, will one day grow into and metastasize into larger criminal activities. And so if there's a little broken part of a window and you don't correct it right away, that small crack in the window will become a bigger crack. This was the justification that the state used, the government, the Bloomberg administration, as an argument for why there needed to be aggressive policing in the city of New York to interdict criminal activity, most specifically in the form of guns on the street. And so the reason why I wanted to focus on that this whole issue became, in my mind's eye, anew an issue during the mayoral primary in the Democratic Party. And participants should take note that there were candidates who, in a sense, ran the gamut of the political spectrum. There were progressives on the Democratic Party, all the way to the current nominee who was billed as the moderate in the Democratic on the Democratic ticket. But what in my mind is more interesting is that he was viewed and favored by, and the polls bear that out, by a majority of Democratic voters in the city of New York because of his quote unquote moderate stance. His moderate stance is, as best as I can understand it, is to make the argument that there is room for greater police activity as a result of an uptick in criminal activity in the city of New York. I would argue that whenever that phraseology is used, it always has a decidedly unequal application to people of color in the city of New York. And maybe the participants on this call might not be troubled, but I, from my perch, am troubled because I see that as the beginnings of a reemergence of the view that there is a justification, a la through broken windows, for much more police aggressive behavior in our communities. And whenever that happens, the brunt of the impact of it seems to me, always falls on people of color. Maybe I am jaded. Maybe I have a certain degree of bias, but that is my view. I don't know that I want to go much further than that, Kate, just to paint a broad picture of the fact that even though on the one hand, we laud the fact that we have a constitution, and in the constitution we have a Bill of Rights, presumably rights that are that are inalienable, that can't be separated from us as human beings. In practicality, when we see the operations of government, many of these lofty goals that we like to herald as the bedrock of our constitutional form of government seemingly gets very, very small when applied to people of color. I would just then add, perhaps unrelated, but it, in my mind's eye, it cannot go, in my view, unnoticed. During the Trump administration, and this is just my view, during the Trump administration, he talked about caravans of illegals coming from Central American countries. And there was an immigration crisis. And during the Trump administration, there was an immigration crisis. During the Obama administration, there was an immigration crisis. In every president in my lifetime. I would say to the participants on this call, if you go back and you check how all of those illegals were treated, even when they were forced. The most recent times during the Trump administration to sleep on the concrete with these silver insulated bags on them, and many people felt as though that this was inhumane. We never saw the spectacle of man's inhumanity to man as we did over the last couple of days with the treatment of Haitians at the southern border. That the authorities now seem emboldened to raise the stakes in the manner in which they treat us by using. We still can't describe what it is. Are there whips? Are there what is it that they're using down there? But in the most grotesque way, hurting people into areas of containment. This is deeply, deeply troubling. And I would argue that whenever there is a juxtaposition between the government and entities that the government wants to control, there is a stark difference between how the government responds to people of color, in this case, people of Black skin, than they do of other groups that they're seeking to contain. And it causes one to wonder, even in the midst of these exceptions that I have just mentioned, perhaps we need to take a greater look at these conditions that we laud under the Constitution and have a greater discussion. And I would be willing to do that. I will say in closing, at least in my public policy class, my students have no choice, but they are forced to reckon with these kinds of challenges in my classroom. So I thank you for allowing me to paint a broad constitutional survey for you as a way of talking about racial justice and its application. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Vice President Crookendale. That was absolutely, it was moving, and it was significant. And I'm so glad that when we talk about the Constitution here at MCNY, we talk about it in rigorous ways and think about the depths of the inequities, and think about it and are transparent in that. There have been a number of things posted to the chat. Desi says, hearing rhetoric like illegals is infuriating. We must infuse and demand respect throughout our conversations about undocumented people in our nation. And I'm glad that you ended on that note, Vice President Crookendale, because this is also a day to think about citizenship, and the whole concept of citizenship is as fraught as the whole concept of the equity in the Constitution. So you tied that together well. And Ali has posted a number of links.
Sequence might have, okay. Any questions that I could answer, or things that I might clarify?
Participants, if you have any questions, you can just put it in the chat.
She could audibilize them. You could make that happen.
I think I can, yes.
Desiree, why don't you speak up and supposed to write in it?
I'm just gonna allow everybody.
Hi there, thank you. Can I be heard?
Yes.
Awesome. What I was going to say is, this is such an important and timely conversation, particularly as there is such a rise in pushback on critical race theory. Mm-hmm. And so much of what you referenced is very referential to critical race theory, which really looks at the ways in which the law and our legal system has cemented racism in our nation. And so really understanding how the law is used as an instrument to oppress, I think, is really important as we look at ways to elevate our conversation around eradicating racism and white supremacy. It's important to really look at the systems that enact, all of those ways in which we overtly and really, I don't want to say secretly, but it's very insidious in our nation. But I think what's important is that when we look at critical race theory and this pushback on it, and the ways in which so many of our K through 12 institutions are trying to implement DEI, which is really informed by critical race theory, the pushback has been really daunting and deflating. People don't want to talk about the truth. And I mean, it really is just another ridiculous culture war wedge. You know, it's anti-masks and anti-vaccine and anti-CRT. They're really just tentacles of the same animal. And I think this refusal and this pushback on truth about what are the genesis of our nation is, it's just such a critical reason that we're having, you know, such a problem around really catapulting from where we were in 2020 when we were having this reckoning around race. This is the pushback on that.
You say that so eloquently. I thank you so much for that, Desiree. Right on point as far as I'm concerned.
Surely, thank you.
I would just add just briefly to what Desiree has said, because, you know, knowledge sets you free, is my view. And so it might be interesting for participants at some point to go back and read what I think has always been a really, really powerful case that amplifies what Desiree is talking about. And interestingly enough, it's a case out of Texas, and it's called Sweat versus Painter, like SWEAT versus Painter. I would invite students to go and read that, because I think it might, you might be alarmed, and it might finally call you if you haven't been there yet, to, you know, to a sense of consciousness about how, as Desiree so eloquently put it, how laws can be used against us in all of its many forms. So you might want to read that at your leisure. Sweat versus Painter.
Ali, you've posted lots of articles. Is there anything you want to tell us about? What sorts of links you're feeling compelled to share?
Yeah, thank you, Kate. Thank you, Dean Crookendale, for the feedback. It's just started resonating in my involvement, heavily involvement after 9/11 events and the violation of civil rights and every type of, you know, human rights for the Arabs or South Asian or Muslim communities in New York, especially under the Bloomberg administration. And even until now, this unconstitutional surveillance continue to terrorize not just mosques, but every Arab and, you know, store, coffee shops in the community. So we are living that experience now, and taking example of what's been happening with African American community, Native community, minority communities, is saying like history is repeating itself. And in my opinion, one of the most important things that, you know, discrimination or racism impact us all. And if we don't stand up together as one community, this will continue to impact us, no matter who is the governor or who is in charge. People of color have to stand up together, to stand up, you know, against this injustice.
Thank you, Ali. Does anyone else have anything they want to share before we adjourn? All right, thank you, everyone. Thank you, Vice President Crookendale.
I agree, Ali.
Go ahead. Desi, were you?
I just wanted to give some snaps up to Ali and say thank you for that.
Thank you.
I also wanted to share the Truth Be Told campaign, which is pushing back on the pushback, basically, on critical race theory. So I shared some of those things in the chat as well.
There's an interesting article about the pushback and the whole kind of politicization of it by Jelani Cobb and
Oh, yeah.
So thank you also to you, Desi, for always being articulate and passionate, and Ali, and everybody who joined us. It was well worth the wait. And again, I just want to remark on how lucky I feel to be at an institution where this is what celebrating the Constitution means. Thank you all.